So the biggest loser so far in this trade war, and it's really my apologies to the rest of the world. I hold an American passport, and so to those of you outside our borders, I'm sorry. We didn't all vote for this. Most Americans are waking up and understanding how destructive this is.
Hi, I'm Fergus Macphee, and welcome to the Trump Report on Times Radio. Today I'm speaking to Justin Wolfers, Professor of Public Policy and Economics at the University of Michigan. Justin, thank you very much for joining us on the Trump Report today.
Mate, the Trump Report, that sounds scary.
I promise I'll try not to scare you too much.
Okay, great. I can't promise the same because I'm here to talk about economics.
We will be talking about economics within the sphere of Donald Trump, and we'll get straight into this. Now, we are quite used to this by now, which is the Trump administration making decisions and then, at least in part, maybe rowing back on them or cooling their rhetoric. And despite China facing 145% tariffs from the US, Trump now is saying that these could come down substantially. And his Treasury Secretary, Scott Bezant, even says there could be a trade deal between the nations. Can you try and make this make sense for me?
So I think it was Friday, Bezant said the tariffs are unsustainable. Then Trump teased they're coming down yesterday. Then Bezant denied that the tariffs were coming down in a roundabout way. And then the White House press secretary walked out and said unequivocally the China tariffs are not changing at all. And so I guess you're left with the question, which one of those folks is in charge? Which one of those is carrying the message? Look, I think, let me try and read between the lines. The claim that 145% tariffs between the US and China are unsustainable is just an obvious fact. That's not a policy decision. You don't need to ask a Treasury Secretary that. You could ask me that, or you could ask anyone who's in business. The claim that Trump wants to pretend there's something going on swirling in the air when in fact he's been waiting next to the phone like a teenage girl, waiting for Xi to call, and Xi still hasn't called, and he can't get Xi's attention no matter what. That's also a fact. And in terms of policy, the White House has not announced anything improving with respect to China.
Can you see them announcing anything anytime soon? I know you made a graph on X which sort of outlines how long it's been since Xi and President Trump spoke.
So they last spoke 3 days before the inauguration. So all of this, I want your attention, focus on us, we're going to have to do a deal, let's get together, has led to nothing. It's quite striking the extent of economic pain inflicted on everyday Americans and indeed on the global economy, all to get someone's attention. But they're asking for attention the wrong way, and so not getting that attention. By the way, that's a very good rule for parenting, probably not such a good rule for international trade. So, it's an expensive way forward. This is a shambolic White House. It's breaking all the rules. Sometimes it breaks those rules and gets things done in ways that others can't. I'm not saying I approve. I'm saying that it's getting things done that it would otherwise be very difficult. But on this particular issue, it's done nothing but create chaos.
I know this is something you've spoken about a lot when you talk about chaos. You said that we're sort of almost in a situation at the moment where every time Trump does something that directly goes against his instincts, the markets respond positively to that.
That's quite a literal claim. You can take any stock chart and you'll see that when Trump announced the April 2 tariffs, stocks tanked. When those tariffs became clearer, they tanked again. When he announced the 90-day pause, they spiked, biggest spike in ages. When he talked about firing Fed Chair Jerome Powell, they tanked. When he walked that back, they spiked. When he said he might walk back the tariffs on China, they spiked. Every time Trump does less Trump, markets applaud.
I guess my question then is, what is the end goal here? Is this some grand plan, or is it just mistake after mistake?
I try to stay out of doing Trumpology. I don't know what's inside one man's brain. What I can tell you is about the economic consequences. This is an unusual way of doing economic policy. So far, it's been destructive, and so far, it hasn't worked. The tariffs, if you listen to the administration, so I'm not trying to look inside anyone's brain, the tariffs have been a policy in search of a rationale forever. The first tariffs were to get rid of fentanyl in the United States or to get cooperation on reducing illegal immigration. Then we moved to talking about tariffs that would onshore manufacturing. And we talked about national security. Then we talked about raising tax revenue so that we could offer tax cuts to everyone. And the actual April 2nd tariffs were set proportionate to the bilateral trade deficit, which is a whole different beast and its own special incoherence. And so we talked, therefore, about bilateral trade deficits as being what they were trying to cure. Then the president backed down, and it all became about isolating China. He's done that by isolating America from the rest of the world. And you can see that the rationale shifts. And then, as part of the back down, it became about making deals. So you can see the rationale shifts day by day. The thing is, those different rationales would lead you to very different tariffs. Right? If you cared about national security, you might put a tariff on steel, but not leather saddles. But we have an equally high tariff on leather saddles. If you cared about onshoring manufacturing, you might put a tariff on aluminum, but not bananas. We can never grow bananas in the United States, but we have tariffs on bananas. So the incoherence of this, if you wanted to import an electric battery from China right now, you would pay 145% tariff. If you put that battery inside a Chinese laptop, you pay a 20% tariff. And if you put that Chinese-made battery inside a Vietnamese laptop, you pay a 10% tariff. So the incoherence of this, I think, is completely obvious. And so because they haven't figured out the rationale, they haven't figured out the right tariff plan, and because they haven't figured out the right set of tariffs, they in fact lack the leverage for what they want to do. So the latest call is, we're in this to strike deals. We're going to strike deals with all 192 other countries in the world within 90 days. Never mind that any individual trade deal usually takes 2 to 5 years. The problem with that is, if what you wanted to do was, say, strike a better deal with China, what you do is you'd bring your buddies close. You'd call Europe, you'd call the Brits, you'd call the Aussies, you'd call the Canadians, and you say, let's make sure our supply chains are in order so we've got alternatives if things get tough with China. Instead, what the United States is doing is fighting 192 separate trade wars. China is fighting one trade war. The European Union is fighting one trade war. The Aussies are fighting one trade war. And so what you get is, as a result, the Americans have a much worse bargaining position. This is not the art of the deal. Let me give a very nice example. Turns out the Chinese like eating American barbecue. So there's a Texas barbecue chain in China. Buys a lot of beef. Historically, it bought American beef. American beef just became incredibly expensive because of tariffs. They realized the Australians grow beef. So now you can go to a barbecue restaurant in China and eat Australian beef. What you're seeing there is that China has lots of options when it becomes hard to buy American beef. It can buy Australian beef. Americans don't have that many options. If we want to buy electronics, we've also got, Tim Cook is moving some iPhone production from China to India, but we've also got tariffs on India. And so our next best option from doing business with China just got a whole lot worse.
So what you're saying is all of this essentially is hitting American citizens' pockets hardest.
Yes. So the biggest loser so far in this trade war, and it's really, my apologies to the rest of the world. I hold an American passport, and so to those of you outside our borders, I'm sorry. We didn't all vote for this. Most Americans are waking up and understanding how destructive this is. We saw the IMF recently, every 3 months does a round of forecasts. And so what's nice is you can compare its forecast today with that in January, which we all knew Trump was the incoming president, but he hadn't released the tariff madness. Basically, nothing else happened between those 3 months. And so you could think about how the IMF changed its forecasts as being what it thinks the effect of this policy madness is. So first of all, when I say I'm sorry to the rest of the world, I really mean that, which is economic growth in the rest of the world next year will be 0.5 percentage point lower, which will mean less income, less prosperity, and for many families, more struggles. For Americans, the effects are even larger. In fact, much larger. The two countries in the world most likely to suffer, who are forecast to suffer the most, first is actually Mexico, whose economy is tightly tied to that of the United States, and the second is the United States. There is pain in China, but it's less, and there's pain all around the world. So this is not anybody winning, but what Trump is effectively doing is holding the US economy to ransom and showing I'm willing to punch the American people in the face in order to get a better trade deal. And he's daring leaders in other countries, are you willing to do the same to your people? It may be that Europe decides it's not. So far it is. But I have a funny feeling that China's a little less democratically accountable even than the United States, and so a little more able to bear that pain.
The phrase that Scott Bezant used in his speech to the IIF Global Outlook Forum, he said that America first does not mean America alone. I guess my question is, from an economic point of view, what does it mean?
Well, America first is a slogan, but to the extent that it's translated into political actions, it's been to put up walls around America. It's going to be harder for Americans to do business, both buying and selling, with the rest of the world. And when we do business with people, we also meet them. We go for coffee. We look them in the eye. Sometimes we get to know their families. It's an amazing force for understanding peace and soft power beyond simply the fact that we're exchanging trinkets with each other. The wall that he's put up means, well, let me put it another way. When Russia invaded Ukraine and the rest of the world wanted to show its disapproval, it imposed sanctions on Russia. The idea was we'd cut off the Russian people from the rest of the world. They would find that so painful they would overthrow their government. Trump has imposed sanctions on the American people. It is now harder for us to do business with anyone in the rest of the world. I'm not quite sure I understand the theory by which it's a good way of punishing Russians and helping Americans.
So you say that he's imposed sanctions on the American people. I think earlier this week you also said that he has revealed a fundamental fragility in the American economy. Where exactly does that fragility lie?
Well, it's wonderful to talk to a Brit about this because you might understand some of this. We have a leader who, there's two fragilities I think are worth noting. One is at the level of the leader. We have a leader who I think is unfit for office. Others may disagree. That's their right. But it's a leader bringing forth an economic plan that's likely to cause immense and unhelpful destruction. That's a story that the Brits recognize. You had that once with Liz Truss. And we saw what happened with Liz Truss, which is you put a head of lettuce here and you put Liz Truss's career there. And the question is, which one goes off first? And it turns out British political institutions were strong enough to say no elected leader should be able to put the economic future of the country at jeopardy like this. That hasn't happened in America. So our political institutions don't have that same strength. We are not a parliamentary system. We're a presidential system. There are checks and balances. It turns out that most important parts of policy have to go through Congress. For historical reasons, Congress delegated a lot of this authority to the president. And Congress has gone quiet. I've not heard anything from Congress in months. I'm not even sure they're still alive inside that building. So that fragility suggests American political institutions aren't working the way that they do in other countries to prevent a power-drunk leader making idiosyncratic decisions. There's a second thing the American people have revealed. We elected this guy. Kind of can't forget that. Next time you want to do business with someone, you might think, well, before you do business with someone, you might think, well, what is their future political climate going to look like? And what we've shown is that the American people are willing to elect a leader who abrogates all responsibility, who refuses to live up to past trade deals, who is willing to tip the table in a fit of pique. I think they did that, the American people, because they're angry, and I understand some of that anger. But it's very hard for our foreign trading partners to forget that that is who we are. Now, again, I think there's actually kind of an interesting analogy with Britain, right? Brexit was basically an enormous middle finger to the rest of Europe. The rest of Europe, you'll form some trade relations with the rest of Europe, and you already are, but they'll never forget that. And that will always shape the future of your economic and political relationships with Europe.
I think the phrase that, as you said, a lot of Brits are familiar with, certainly what the opposition and Labour went with, was that Liz Truss crashed the economy, is what we always are told in the UK. I haven't seen sort of people using, that strong a language yet with Donald Trump.
Let me disagree. When you look at surveys of the American people, it's clear that they understand what's going on. Trump is losing the economic argument, and he's losing it enormously. So let me start with the data economists would look at. So if you look at people's expectations for the future path of the economy, consumer confidence has plummeted in the last 2 months faster than it ever has before. Business confidence has plummeted over the past 2 months about as fast as it does during a global pandemic. If you ask people about what they expect inflation to be, it's risen faster over the past 2 months, faster than it ever has before. So that suggests that the argument that tariffs are going to cause price rises, which Trump has countered, that argument has been winning. If you look at expectations of whether the stocks will continue to rise or fall, the chances of a recession, and on and on and on and on, the American people appear to understand the precarious moment that they're in. If you look at public opinion polling on do you approve of Trump's management of the economy, it's sunk faster than it has in any presidential term in history. So the economy hasn't tanked. I should be clear about this. The economy is yet to tank. We see these soft data, these attitudes, and a lot of expectation and a lot of holding your breath and a lot of fear. But there's a lot going on. We came into this with a very, very rapid economic growth, an economy that was performing outstandingly well. And usually when an economy is doing well yesterday, it keeps doing well again tomorrow. And then all the economic data is going to get complicated because people are going to buy a bunch of stuff before the tariffs hit. And so that actually boosts spending in the short run. And so all of this may take a while. We still don't know whether it will filter through into slower growth or a recession. It's going to take a few months, but I think there's no confusing who to blame. And markets are telling us this very clearly. Every time Trump takes a step forward, markets tank. Every time he takes a step backward, they rise. So that also tells you this is not the view of one talking head from America. This is the consensus view of the very smart money on Wall Street.
You said we don't know yet. Are you willing to speculate at all on if we are approaching a global recession?
Let me take the question in two parts, which is a US recession and then a global recession. So my estimate is if nothing interesting had happened in the last 3 months, I think the chance of a recession this year would be about 10%. Normally it's about 14%, but the rest of the global economy seemed in pretty good shape. You know, there's no wars, pandemics, oil shocks. You know, there's bird flu, but they're chickens. So I'd say about a 10% chance normally. Since the madness started, if Trump were to walk every part of it back tomorrow and just say tariffs are back to where they were before, which was approximately zero, get back to work, I'm sorry. I think the chance of a recession this year would be 25%. And if he goes full steam ahead, I think the chance of a recession is 75%. And if he ends up somewhere in between, it's going to end up somewhere in between. Right now, betting markets say the chance of a recession is around about 60%. It's because Trump has backed down a little bit. That probably seems about right. I want to be clear, that doesn't mean it's certain. And it also doesn't mean I'm not worried. It means that recessions are really hard to predict. But for reasons that elude me, someone's moving all the pieces in just a way that it's made it more likely, not less.
I want to end just talking about Elon Musk. There was reports that he and Scott Bezant squared up to one another and got into a sweary shouting match, which was likened to a WWE wrestling bout. Who is in charge? Because it was about the Internal Revenue Service, the row.
Let me step out of my economist box for a moment and say, boy, this sounds a little like toxic masculinity, doesn't it? Let me step back into my economist box. Who is in charge? It's meant to be the president. Start there. It's also meant to be Congress, and it's also above that meant to be the Constitution. But actually all of that's very much in doubt, and that's part of the current moment that we're in, which is frankly terrifying. Let me say a little bit about Elon Musk. First of all, I think it's hilarious that Elon Musk has discovered that it's too expensive for him to remain in government service. He can no longer afford it. Now, what has his contribution been? I think it's time to declare DOGE and Elon Musk an utter failure. And I want to be clear, I love government efficiency. I'm totally in favor of government efficiency. And I think going through and looking line by line and figuring out what we're getting right and what we're getting wrong and having no sacred cows and being willing to examine everything is exactly the right thing. But that's not what Musk did. What Musk did is, if you actually look at the different parts of the budget, the parts that are most politically salient, say USAID, that's where he went. The parts where the most money is, he stayed away from. That's the IRS. Musk promised he would save, with all the brash bravado of a businessman, promised he would save the US government $2 trillion a year. So the first thing I want to say is every economist understood that was a lie, but I don't think he did. I think this is a disconnect, which is the business community does not understand how government works. Here's a very simple model for why I knew that was wrong from the start. There's an old saying that the federal government is an insurance company with an army. The insurance company is Medicare, Medicaid, unemployment insurance, Social Security, and so on. The army, well, it's the army. You might say, where are all the other functions of government, schools and roads and that? They're all state. So then once you know it's an insurance company with an army and we're not going to touch the army, basically the federal government is one big check receiving operation. We call that the IRS, and a check printing operation. That's basically what it is. And so there's a couple of guys employed to make sure the printer doesn't jam. And so if you look at a program like Social Security, literally hundreds of billions of dollars and a skeleton staff next to it. So the idea that the waste was going to come from firing the people, these are just the people who keep the printer running. The question is, what checks do you want to print? That's a much harder question. So he said he'd save $2 trillion. So the visual metaphor I like to use is a football field. It's 100 meters long in America. So 2 trillion is 2,000 billion. So that means each yard on that football field is $20 billion. Musk went from 2 trillion to promising 1 trillion. So he went to the halfway line as the new goal line. Then he claims to have saved 150 billion by next year. But if you look at his wall of receipts, it's actually about 60 billion. That wall of receipts is almost has got so many flaws. There's been article after article about how they're making up facts, cancelling contracts that were worth no dollars, that they appear not to understand how government accounting works. But even if we took that seriously, 60 billion means on that football field of savings is at the 3-yard line. Basically, Musk got nothing done. And the reality is he's probably at the 2-yard line. And then when we say he got to the 2-yard line, even that sounds pretty bad, but realize almost nothing of what he saved was waste, fraud, and abuse. When you shut down USAID, which is a way we chose to spend our money, we thought that it was a way of living up to our values and spreading soft power. If you just stop doing that, that's not stopping waste, fraud, and abuse. We're no longer getting the cost of that, but we're also no longer getting the benefit. And most of what Musk was doing that. So he turned out to be the useful idiot who was able to pretend that politically targeted attacks were about waste, fraud, and abuse. I don't know how much people understand. In fact, he failed at that task.
We could talk about this for hours, I'm sure. I'm afraid we're going to have to go. I'll ask you one more question. Touching on it there with sort of Musk's legacy, if you want to call it that, at DOGE, a lot has happened. We've just spoken about so much. We are almost 100 days into Trump's second term. In another 100 days, what do you foresee in your crystal ball?
So there's a really interesting fact about the first 100 that I think will be true in the second 100, which is almost everything Trump has done through executive order. Almost nothing has gone through Congress, which means the next president can undo it all on the first day. There is no lasting political or economic reform. So amazing reality TV. But if what you want to do is fundamentally transform the American economy, you want achievements that will outlive your presidency, and we're currently at 0. My expectation is that continues, which means we will end the term at 0. Of course, we'll get all the damage that's done along the way.
Well, we'll keep a close eye on that, and hopefully we can speak again.
Hopefully we'll have better things to talk about next time. Sorry, mate, I didn't mean to bring your viewers down. So go and think about, sunshine and ladybirds and flowers and beautiful things as well.
Justin Wolfers, thank you so much for joining us on the Trump Report today.
Pleasure.